So good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all here. My name is Devon Carbado. I'm a professor here at the law school and the Associate Vice Chancellor for Brewing X, which is the research and development arm of the Office of Equity, Diversity and Inclusion. My role this evening is decidedly limited. It is threefold. One, to introduce my wonderful colleague and friend, Laura Gomez, who really needs no introduction. Two, to offer some very brief comments on her terrific book, Manifest Destinies. And three, to shut up and sit down and welcome Laura to this particular position. She'll speak for 20 to 25 minutes. We'll go to Q&A and then to reception. I know there are some of you who have not had the chance to have Laura describe your book. She's happy to do so in the context of the reception. I should apologize at the outset in that I won't be able to stay for the reception of a prior engagement that requires me to leave at approximately 7:20, so please indulge me as I do so. I will be with you in spirit at the reception, however. So, biography. As many of you know, Professor Gomez is a professor of law here at the law school and a professor of sociology by courtesy appointment. She's taught a bunch of courses, which reflects, I think, the depth and breadth of her knowledge. Constitutional law, Latinos and Latinas on the law, criminal law, comparative racialization, civil procedure, and law and society. She is a former interim dean of the Division of Social Sciences, which is the largest division here at UCLA, and a former vice dean of the law school. Though she is a person of impeccable judgment, she made a terrible decision by choosing to leave UCLA some years ago. No, I will not let that one go, Professor Gomez. And she did this at an interesting time, right after helping to found the Critical Race Studies program, and right after serving as one of the inaugural co-directors with Jerry Kahn. During her non-UCLA days, and I'll refer to her time away from UCLA as her non-UCLA days, she, not surprisingly though, accomplished quite a bit. So she was the president of Law and Society. That is a major accomplishment, I have to say, and I think she was the youngest person to serve in that post, and the only Latinx person, I believe, to hold that position as well. She also, during her non-UCLA days, continued her scholarly projects, and it's in that context that she produced Manifest Destiny, a book about which I will say more presently. Eventually, Professor Gomez exercised the very good judgment to return home, and CRS, the law school, and the UCLA community writ large has benefited enormously from her presence. Now, none of what I've said obviously fully captures who Laura Gomez is, but I hope it gives you a window on the kind of professional and intellectual identities that she has managed to produce. So let me move from that brief bio of Professor Gomez to a brief commentary on her book. And here I simply want to describe 5 interventions that the book performs. And these are not, by the way, exhaustive of the contributions that the book makes, but there are contributions that I think it's important that we put into sharp relief. So contribution 1. The book tackles a really important debate about race and ethnicity, particularly as that debate has been mobilized to explain the marginalization of Latinx people. And she does this not by offering a kind of definitive account of race over here and a definitive account of ethnicity over here. What she does instead is to offer an historically contingent and contextually nuanced account of the specific ways in which people of Mexican descent has been racialized. Contribution 2, and relatedly, the book is a powerful articulation of what it means to say that race is a social construction. Scholars across disciplines rehearse ad nauseum the claim that race is a social construction and law constructs race. I'm tempted to ask you all to hold hands and let's say race is a social construction. Nothing magically happens, but this is an idea that really resonates across the disciplines, and in this book you have a sense of why that idea is particularly important. Contribution 3. There are lots and lots of interesting theoretical moves that this book performs. I'm just going to name 3 very quickly. One is the idea of collective naturalization, the process by which a group writ large becomes American in some sense. And Laura rehearses that specific idea with reference to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which, as many of you might know, it's a treaty that the U.S. government imposed on the Mexican government in the aftermath of the Mexican-American War. The treaty effectively naturalized people of Mexican descent as U.S. citizens in the same way that the 14th Amendment effectively naturalized people of African descent as U.S. citizens. Now, the politics underwriting those two naturalization moves are, of course, quite different, but Professor Gomez puts them into conversation with each other in interesting ways. Another important theoretical move that I want to mark here is the conceptualization of people of Mexican descent as off-white. That is to say, people who were sometimes treated formally as white by law, to borrow a phrase from Ian Haney Lopez, but who experienced themselves socially as non-white. And then there is this idea of the reverse one-drop rule. You all know something of the one-drop rule, a regime within which people with quote-unquote one drop of black blood were rendered black. Now, of course, the rule didn't always work in exactly that way, but the basic point is that it was really difficult to kind of whiten your way out of blackness. That was a really impossible project, by and large. The reverse one-drop rule is precisely, though, a rule about whitening, a rule in which one drop of Spanish blood rendered one white. And that's the story that she means to tell with respect to Mexican racialization. A fourth contribution the book makes is its conceptualization of racism. So Professor Gomez conceptualized racism as a nation-building project that is rooted in white supremacy and colonization. Can I get an amen? A nation-building project that is rooted in white supremacy and colonization. And she does this with historical detail, with contextual specificity, and with multiracial sensibility. So one leaves this book with a way of thinking thematically about the interconnections among regimes of racial power that are sometimes disaggregated. I'm thinking here about westward expansionism. I'm thinking about slavery. I'm thinking about Jim Crow. I'm thinking about genocide and displacement. I'm thinking about Chinese exclusion. In Laura's account, each of these regimes are framed as core parts of, rather than exceptions to, American democracy. And last but certainly not least, the book unapologetically centers Mexican subjectivity in the service of a critical and anti-racist intellectual project without resorting to what I sometimes perceive to be simplistic arguments about black-white binaries. I could go on, but I won't. What I will simply say is that this is a brilliant book. It's a tour de force. It's rigorously researched, rigorously argued. It's beautifully written, and it will stand the test of time. I stand by that. It is precisely the kind of book that I would like to claim as my own, but I can't because I didn't write it. So what I will do instead is to claim Laura Gomez as a dear friend and a colleague, and ask you to join me in congratulating her on the 10th anniversary of her book.
Thank you, Devon. What he left out, well, a lot of things, not about the book, but about the story of the time away, is that, and please feel free to fill in seats. There's plenty of seats, so don't be shy. What he left out was that he was persistent. So I left UCLA because I felt that it was better to have my son grow up, at least for a core part of his life, near his grandparents. And it was better for for us to be near his grandparents. So we moved to Albuquerque, and he started first grade there. And Devon was persistent about every year saying, don't you want to come back? Don't you want to come back? And I say, no, we're very happy, we're very happy. And, when he became associate dean at the law school, he was particularly persistent, and, he wouldn't stop bothering me. And finally I said, well, maybe I would consider a visit because Alejandro's going to be in high school next year, and maybe we could go for a year. But he has his wily ways. And what I agreed to do was this visit, but by the time it all happened, it was, I think, what his grand scheme had been, which it was this great offer that I couldn't say no to. And it was also just the pull, the magnetism of my wonderful, wonderful colleagues, several of whom are here. Some of my new colleagues are here, but those colleagues like thinking about coming back to work with Devon Carbado, thinking of coming back to work with Cheryl Harris, my dear friend and colleague, with Jerry Kong, with Sung-Hee Kim. And this is one of those dangerous things where I started going down that road of naming people. But I will just say that there is no place like UCLA. And some of the new recruits that I was lucky enough to have a little role in bringing last year when I was Dean of Social Sciences are in the room also. And I will say it again, there is no place like UCLA. And UCLA Law is this incredibly special, unique law school because at a moment when we were so beaten down because of Proposition 209, we founded the Critical Race Studies program. And that just, it saved us as faculty. We sometimes pretend that we did it for the students. And there's a lot of benefits to the students, and we love that there are, but we were just going crazy, and we needed to do it for ourselves. And so it just is this amazing community. I'm happy to be here, and I guess the other thing that I need to say is just thank you to my colleagues. It takes a village to get someone hired, in terms of the politics and the ad hoc reports and the reviews and the strategizing, and I had that village here, and it's one that we keep paying it forward, right? So it's just a great place to be, and I'm happy to have you. I'm happy that you won. My parents are not, but I am happy that you won. So. I want to say a special thank you to Jasleen Kohli in the back and Jyoti Nanda, who worked on this program. Also, Phoenix Diller, who's not with us, did a lot of the legwork, and so I really appreciate the work, a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes, and that will continue to be going on as we get through the night. I want to give a special shout out to my former students, my current students, meaning last semester, and my future students. Are there any students in the room? I can't hear you. That's it, a wave? Okay. No, it's very nice to have you all here. I know students have a lot on their mind all the time, and it's great to see some students. And I have some of my PhD students here too, so that is very nice. So I have been debating how to kind of give you a sense of what 300 pages are like in 25 minutes. Luckily, Devon did that. He gave this kind of sweeping overview, and I really appreciate that, because what I'm going to do is actually read from the preface to the second edition, because I think it gives you a good sense of why I wanted to do a second edition, and why you should read the book, which in order to read the book you have to buy the book. So buy the book, which is for sale out here, a 50% discount to students, thanks to Critical Race Studies. And so we will get to that. And I blew this up in really big font, so I didn't need to wear my glasses, my reading glasses, so we'll see if it's big enough, It's hard to predict how academic books will fare. Often they're written for tenure, not the case with this book. And sometimes they're written for a very narrow audience, and they're not meant to really speak to folks beyond that little frame. Once in a while, an author is lucky enough to publish the right book at the right time. And I'm fortunate that may be the case with Manifest Destinies. I routinely hear from people who say how reading Manifest Destinies has changed the way they think about the world. In some 75 community and academic talks about the first edition, I have been impressed with the hunger by Latinos and non-Latinos for understanding this era of American history and what it may tell us about the nation's present and the nation's future. I'm grateful for the feedback I received at these settings, as well as for the comments provided in dozens of book reviews in the press, blogs, and academic journals in the fields of history, sociology, ethnic studies, and law, some written by people in this room. I'm most proud of two unusual ways in which the book has reached audiences outside academic circles. In 2015, the renowned federal judge Jack B. Weinstein cited Manifest Destinies in a ruling in which he found a violation of the constitutional rights of a Latina mother who was suing on behalf of her son who had been exposed to lead poisoning. In another instance, the Albuquerque Public Schools, which has a student body that is 79% non-white and majority Hispanic, recently announced that it will offer ethnic studies courses at its 13 high schools. And on the reading list is Manifest Destinies. Thank you, that's very kind. But as a graduate of elementary, junior high, and high schools in Albuquerque, this really struck me as just unfathomable, right? Because I did not learn this history as a student, or as a college student, or as a graduate student, and so that really meant a lot. In part, the success of the book is due to a naturally expanding audience. Latinos are 17% of the total U.S. population, and within our lifetimes, we will be 30% of the U.S. population. 7 out of 10 Latinos are Mexican Americans. And it makes sense that they would find compelling this story of the nation's original Mexican Americans, those who overnight, when the war between the U.S. and Mexico ended, became U.S. citizen. What's more, Latinos are a young population with an average age of 29 compared to 43 for non-Hispanic whites. In 2014, the most recent year for which data are available, there were 2.3 million Latinos aged 18 to 24 who were enrolled in college, graduate, or professional school. And this was an increase of 12% since the turn of the century. And I know some of those 18 to 24-year-old Latinos are sitting in this room. Today's Latino college students can choose to major in Chicano studies, Latino studies, or ethnic studies more generally, or they can opt to take just a course in one of these programs. While Chicana, Chicano, Mexican American, or Latino studies programs exist across the Southwest and in several Midwestern states as well, they are most numerous in California. It's not surprising that every university, every campus in California, from community colleges to research universities, has some kind of Chicano Latino studies program, whether a department or a program of some kind. It's not surprising because Latinos are 15%, I'm sorry, there are 15 million Latinos in California. In the fall of 2016, when I was interim dean, I had the honor of guest lecturing about Manifest Destinies to Professor Devon Carbado's Chicano Studies intro course, and there were 800 students enrolled. It's just about the 25th anniversary, we're going to be celebrating it in May, of the hunger strike at UCLA that was led by students and some faculty, primarily students, that led directly to the formation of the Chicano Studies program at that time in the form of the Cesar Chavez Interdepartmental Program on Chicana and Chicano Studies, now a full-fledged academic department, and granting now in the last 6 years, the nation's only PhD in Chicana or Chicano studies. And so I think back to that moment, and some people in this room remember that the hunger strike and the events afterwards. Don't be shy. There's plenty of seats. Just come on in and take a seat. And I don't think any of us could have contemplated that there would routinely be 800 students taking the intro courses, as there has been for several years, the 2 intro courses in Chicano Studies. Latino students, that was, by the way, not in the preface, but I just had to say it. Okay. Latino students are putting pressure on colleges and universities to offer courses taught by a growing cadre of PhDs in Chicano studies, comparative ethnic studies, history, and the social sciences. Building on the earlier founding generation of Mexican-American scholars, these and other scholars have created an exciting interdisciplinary field that draws on virtually every traditional discipline in the social sciences and in the humanities. The blossoming of Chicana, Chicano, and Latina, Latino studies has occurred at the same time that critical race theory has taken root in the academy. Critical race theory started in the legal academy, but it has branched out to a variety of other scholarly fields, including but not limited to education, criminology, ethnic studies, and the social science disciplines. Manifest Destinies then arrived at an opportune time in the evolution of 2 scholarly fields central to its analysis. And again, that's what I said about timing. It's just dumb luck when things come to be. Manifest Destinies entered the scene when readers were increasingly interested in the growing Latino population and its origins. It gave voice to those who had the sense that the conventional history of the American West was at best lacking and at worst malicious in its omission of the violence Americans used to establish control over the Mexican and indigenous populations in the vast territory it took from Mexico. Manifest Destinies provides a necessary correction to the history of race and racism in 19th century America, given its focus on slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. It reaches beyond white over black oppression to tell a connected yet different story about imperial expansion west and south that produced distinctive racial dynamics involving Native Americans and Mexican Americans. I hope this anniversary edition appeals to both new and returning readers who seek a more complete history of the Southwest and the original Mexican Americans whose destinies, along with other social groups, unfolded in unexpected ways. As I was writing this book in the first years of the 21st century, there was a sense of the burgeoning political power wielded by Hispanics. In 2005, Antonio Villaraigosa appeared on the cover of Newsweek under the banner Latino Power as the newly elected mayor of Los Angeles, the first mayor of Mexican origin to lead the city in more than 130 years. Too bad he's not running for anything now. In 2007, then New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson became the first Latino candidate to seek a major political party's presidential nomination. Quite apart from electoral politics, as many as 5 million people, most of them Latinos, rallied in 2006 as I was finishing the book, rallied in 2006 in 160 cities across the country to successfully kill an immigration bill broadly considered anti-Mexican and anti-immigrant. The spring 2006 protest especially galvanized young Latinos, with surveys showing that upwards of half of the participants were under age 30. While research shows that 3/4 of the 2006 protesters were American citizens, there is no question that the rallies marked a turning point for immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, who openly and proudly demanded respect and civil rights. Many observers of these marches and rallies have concluded that they fostered the politicization of Latino participants, as well as those Latinos who were watching the protest in the media. And this in turn catalyzed a huge surge in voter registration, in naturalization so that people could vote, and in lobbying at all levels of government. And indeed, many activists attribute the genesis of the Dreamers movement to the 2006 rallies. Though proposed legislation failed at the national level, President Obama took executive action to create DACA. Of course, President Trump rescinded DACA 6 months ago, giving Congress an artificial deadline of yesterday to find a legislative fix. Congress is no closer to doing so today, and 2 federal circuit courts will likely hear the government's appeal to 2 rulings that found that Trump's action violated the law. Manifest Destinies appeared in the same month that Americans elected Barack Obama president, an event that gave great hope to so many, especially African Americans and other people of color. Yet after 2 Obama presidential terms and a year into the Trump administration, a very different attitude toward immigrants grips the nation today. Obama presided over more deportation than any other president in history, and his Homeland Security apparatus put in place some of the most draconian immigration policies ever implemented, including E-Verify and Secure Communities, which have caused so many immigrants, and certainly those without papers, to live in constant fear of deportation. Obama was unable to push forward comprehensive immigration legislation, as he did on the health care front, and he presided over an era of increasingly repressive anti-immigrant state and local laws, in part that were passed in part because of the vacuum at the federal level. These laws are exemplified by Arizona's SB 1070, and they contributed to larger trends that have transformed immigration from a civil offense, like a traffic violation, to a criminal offense, and often to felony with very harsh sanctions, massive deportations, and prison-like detention of immigrants, including children. The Immigration and Customs Enforcement branch of Homeland Security entered hundreds of agreements with state and local law enforcement to help ICE enforce immigration policies. These laws and law enforcement practices have led to the pervasive violation of the civil rights of Latino-looking Americans, a particularized variant of racial profiling by police without regard to whether Latinos were born in the United States or had a legal right to be in the country. In the decades since Manifest Destinies was published, Americans have ricocheted through several popular ideologies about race and racial inequality. For example, the colorblind idea of race was the most popular mainstream idea of race at the start of the 21st century. Colorblind race is the idea that neither individuals nor state actors should see race, but instead, by ignoring racial difference, we will achieve racial equality. That's colorblind race in its best light. With Obama's election in 2008, the post-racial narrative gained steam. And this was the idea that, well, we have an African-American family living in the White House, so how could there be racism? Post-racialism, however, was dealt a severe, if not life-threatening blow when the public became galvanized by the continuing and now videotaped police killings of African Americans that produced outrage and political mobilization via the Black Lives Matter movement. A fundamental argument to which Professor Carbado alluded in Manifest Destinies is that racial categories and racial hierarchies are socially constructed. And this, too, has emerged as a popular ideology about race. To say race, racial categories, and racial hierarchies are socially constructed is to acknowledge that they are the product of social, political, and legal practices and processes, such that they change over time as social conditions change. At the same time, race and racism do not change in a vacuum, but rather are shaped and limited by history. Race has been a persistent feature of social organization as long as the United States has existed. That does not mean that racial categories and the racial hierarchy do not change, but that such change is constrained. Today, the claim that race is socially constructed likely seems second nature to many of you, especially those who are CRS concentrators in the room, as it has become a popular idea among scholars and laypersons alike. But in 2007, when this book came out, many on the right argued that to claim that race was socially constructed was tantamount to saying that race was not real, that it was no longer socially relevant, but simply a matter of individual choice, oftentimes belittled as identity politics. Today, after a historic presidential election, however, it is whites who are openly embracing their racial identity as a driver of their political beliefs and behavior as racial politics, as identity politics. Admittedly, a small portion of whites are to the extreme right, that is, white nationalists who openly denigrate Hispanics, blacks, Muslims, Jews, and others as racially inferior. But a much larger and not only socially acceptable, but now politically ascendant segment of whites openly embraces the idea that whites deserve rights and privileges as whites. These voters are diehard Trump fans who openly challenge a society in which non-white people claim social equality and political rights. The mantra, "Make America Great Again," harkens back to the 1950s. Before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the 1965 amendments to our immigration laws that removed the racist restrictions on immigrants from countries in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. The old approach where white normativity was hegemonic precisely because it was assumed but did not have to be openly articulated has broken down. So let me just break that down. So white normativity, the idea that white is in the background, we don't have to talk about it, and everyone knows what it is. We have to talk about those who are different. We have to talk about those who are black, those who are Latino, etc. That has now broken down, and so there is a segment of whites who are arguing that no, we actually do want you to see us. We are white, and we want you to see us, and we want you to give us these rights and these protections as whites, versus other whites who would say, oh, I support diversity and I support this normativity, this white normativity, where we just don't have to talk about it. We're still going to have most of the political power and most of the economic power, but we don't really have to talk too much about it. We'll give you diversity. The primary target of the new white identity movement is immigrants presumed to be illegals, presumed to be Mexican. It does not matter that 1/3 of undocumented immigrants are not Mexican, including for a time First Lady Melania Trump. All Latinos are assumed to be undocumented, even Puerto Ricans who are not immigrants at all. This is certainly not to say that blacks, including black immigrants from Latin America, Africa, and the Caribbean, are off the hook as racial scapegoats, but to assert that Latinos are perceived by many whites today as a primary racial threat. In this climate, those on both the right and the left still struggle with the question of where Mexican Americans and Latinos fit in the American racial order, the question at the heart of Manifest Destinies. Candidate Trump did not cause this turn of event. He simply seized upon it and ran the touchdown play. Trump's tirades against Mexico and illegal aliens were the red meat he continually fed to rally his voter base during the Republican primaries, with no softening occurring during the general election campaign. Mexican hating was central to launching his candidacy in June 2015. He said, quote, "When Mexico sends us its people, they're not sending their best. They're sending people that have lots of problems. They're sending They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people, unquote. The Mexican man as criminal, especially as sexual predator of white women, fits comfortably with the long-standing trope of the black man as predator that white politicians have relied on for so long. It did not matter that Trump's claim lacked any empirical basis, that in fact immigrants commit fewer crimes than native-born Americans, and that undocumented migrants commit fewer crimes. That was irrelevant to the tone that he was hoping to stir up. The 2016 presidential election also functioned as a litmus test between those right-of-center voters who take it for granted that the children and perhaps even the grandchildren of immigrants from Latin America will never be real Americans, always perpetual foreigners, on the one hand, and those whites who reacted in outrage to Trump's attack on a Mexican-American federal judge who was randomly selected to preside over 2 lawsuits against Trump University. Judge Gonzalo Curiel was born in East Chicago, Indiana, a working-class town that has had a thriving Mexican-American population for more than a century, as well as a growing Puerto Rican population since World War II. In May 2016, Trump lashed out at Curiel at a San Diego rally after generating audience chants of "Build the Wall." Trump referred to Curiel as Mexican, goading his audience, quote, "I think Judge Curiel should be ashamed of himself. I'm telling you, this court system, judges in this court system, federal court, they ought to look into Judge Curiel, because that Judge Curiel is doing, what he's doing is a total disgrace." A few days later, in the Wall Street Journal and on Twitter, Trump doubled down on his claim, saying that he was unfair to hear these cases because of his Mexican heritage and because he belonged to Latino lawyers' associations. So I can only imagine what Trump thought a few weeks ago when Judge Curiel was appointed to hear the case actually involving the wall, right? The plaintiffs claiming that the government had violated environmental impact regulations in moving forward with the wall, and actually Judge Curiel actually decided for the government, although I'm sure that case will be appealed. Although many criticized Trump's judge bashing, including Speaker of the House Paul Ryan, who in a moment of rare sanity called Trump's statement the textbook definition of a racist comment, Trump refused to apologize. The fact that Trump criticized a pillar of the Latino community who had in one generation climbed from being the son of a Mexican immigrant steelworker to becoming an Article III judge under the Constitution was not lost on Latino voters. Before becoming a federal judge, Curiel worked as a federal prosecutor going after drug dealers in San Diego, even as his life was threatened by the Mexican cartels. He was appointed a state judge in California by a Republican governor, and despite his education and professional achievements, he was still just a Mexican to Trump. And this reinforced the fact that non-Hispanics often see Latinos as unwelcome immigrants, perpetual foreigners. In the postscript of the second edition, I explore these dynamics in greater detail, arguing that Latinos in the 21st century are racialized as non-white rather than still in the liminal off-white racial status of the original Mexican Americans who are the subject of manifest destinies. And so this links back to what Devon said. When I was talking about off-white and this in-between status, I was talking about that 19th century moment when there was this contrast, this contradiction between legal whiteness on the one hand and social segregation and oppression as a racial minority. But today, I would argue that we're not at all in that liminal status, right? That it's very clear that Latinos belong to the non-white side of the ledger. More than ever, all Americans should be aware of the long and rich history of Mexican Americans, as well as the complex position of the original Mexican Americans who negotiated their place in both the regional and national racial landscapes of the late 19th century. This book is required reading for anyone who hopes to understand the dramatic and unstoppable demographic shift that is changing the United States from a majority white to a so-called majority minority nation. Manifest Destinies provides a starting point for thinking about social policies that will move us forward as a nation in ways that allow for the full participation of Latinos. Rather than repeat the mistakes of the past, we must understand how we got here in order to move forward in a way that seeks to perfect our national promise of equality and civic incorporation for all. Moreover, it gives us the historical context to understand that today's racial politics have not developed in a vacuum. Mexicans have been intertwined with this country since 1846, when the United States invaded Mexico under a pretext. The result was the taking of land, but it was also the taking of people, the first Mexican Americans, and a steady stream of Mexican migrants since then. Until we understand this history, we will not be able to deal effectively or humanely with the migration north. Until we understand that there is a special and unique relationship between the United States and Mexico. Along with the 1965 amendments to immigration laws that ended racial discrimination against immigrants from Latin America, Asia, and Africa, the more conventional civil rights legislation of the 1960s. Sorry, wait a second. Where was I? Okay. I think I lost something in here when I was making the font bigger. But the point is to say that it is precisely those civil rights movement victories of the 1960s, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the changes to the immigration law in 1965, changes that Trump is now saying when he says, I want no more chain migration, that he is talking about reverting back to pre-1965 racist immigration policies. It is those changes which have produced the nation that we know today, which have produced the growing majority-minority shift across the country, already seen in places like California and Texas and New York, and coming to a state near you, inevitably. And we must understand the slogan of Make America Great Again as seeking to overturn those victories, even as we acknowledge that those victories haven't gone far enough, right? Even as we acknowledge that those civil rights era victories, aren't perfect and have limitations. And so we must confront the fact that those who chant the slogan really are nostalgic for the time before 1965, when America was genuinely a different place. And so I think what I'm going to do is stop now and take some questions. And maybe what I'll do is take maybe 3 or 4 questions all together and then respond. That way that I can hear you guys a little bit instead of you just hearing me.
And I will read the excerpt.
Yes, I know, because you've got your meeting. Thank you, Devon. Yes.
So a couple of questions, I'll roll them into one.
Okay, and can you just share who you are, if you don't mind?
Yeah, my name is Juanetes Americo Rodriguez Orellana. I'm a recent UCI Law class of 2017 grad.
We won't hold that against you here.
We're a UC family, right? So it's all
There you go.
So first, thank you for all your work.
welcome.
You know, as I think you might remember, I invited you to a symposium that we had last year.
Great.
So good to see you again.
Yeah, likewise.
One, I guess, comment, question I have is, I guess, why you choose to use the words Hispanic and illegal aliens is one question. And second, I guess I would friendly push back on your argument that you have, I guess, that the folks are trying to, I guess, revert back to a pre-1960s before the CRA, the VRA, and the INA changes. And my argument would be, without any statistical analysis behind it, any qualitative, quantitative analysis would be, I think the Supreme Court got it wrong, and education should be a fundamental right.
Mhm.
And because of that, it's had changes, and folks just are making these racist arguments, but they don't realize they're making racist arguments. And so I guess that's, I don't know how to frame the question exactly. But
Yeah, no, I get it. That's, no, it's a very, and you don't have to be friendly in pushing back. It's good to take it on. Okay, so let's get a few more remarks, and then we'll kind of just collect them, and then I'll respond. Yes.
It seems that the most important Senate race is going to be De Leon and the old guard Feinstein. De Leon is the head of the Senate of California. He's running for senator. And he's a progressive, where Dianne Feinstein says she's one, and she's not. She's back Trump all the way. Do you think this is the most important election in California history?
Okay. I will get to that. A couple more comments. Yes.
I must admit that I have not read the book yet.
But you did buy it, and I did sign it earlier. Yes.
And so I was just wondering if you could briefly talk about how a Black Mexican American identity would fit into your paradigm of the construction of the Mexican American race, especially in trying to combat anti-Blackness within the Mexican American community.
Terrific question. Yes, Alvina.
It sounds like a lot of, and I haven't read it yet either, but it sounds like a lot of the book is theorizing about the way that the Mexican American race is positioned alongside other races at this time, and I'm wondering if you have any comments or thoughts about how that relationship among the races has progressed.
Great. Rebecca.
Muchísimas gracias. My name is Rebecca Avalos. I'm a social scientist, so I'm going to offer two questions that I hope are not too long. My first question is, how can we think about the post-truth paradigm? The post-truth paradigm, there's like fake news, these charges of like lack of viewing evidence and proof that seem fundamental to a healthy democracy. How can we see the post-truth centering what is so obvious in this Trump administration as solidifying and encouraging racist, irrational discourse? And then my second question, slash kind of comment, I really found a lot of truth in your comment of Trump as coming in this chaotic, perfect time to make this slam goal, in the regard of your statement of Make America Great Again as a temporal nostalgic statement pre-1965. And when I think of the 1960s and civil rights advancements, I mean, voting rights was a pillar of that decade as far as advancements. And right before Trump, as you're stating that he's coming in at a perfect time, we have the salient circulation of voter fraud myths, right, that are targeting Latinos because they're illegally voting. And we also have the elimination of the Section 5 of the Title 5 of the 1965 Voting Rights Act right at the end of President Obama's tenure. So it looks like it's lining up there too, on top of the required IDs for folks who don't have a lot of money and the manipulation of the polling places and hours. So it makes sense that all of this background constellation work is lining up for him to just make this white hetero touchdown.
Yeah, I think I that's a great comment. So I think I'm gonna start with your comment, Rebecca, and then I'm gonna work my way around to ending with the pairing of, I'm sorry, I forgot your name. Christina and Alvina's comments, which are connected and really big ones. So in terms of this moment, I think, in reading I don't know how many of you had the chance to read the indictment of the Russians a few weeks back. So one of there was a kind of quasi Black Lives Matter organization that has gotten quite a bit of media attention. I can't remember their name offhand. Somebody might shout it out. And there were various Republican organizations that Russian organizations were posing as Republican organizations, and like the Tennessee organization, which got a lot of retweets, including by those in the Trump campaign. And there was this fake Russian organization that was called Secured Borders, and it was this group, Secured Borders, or this, I don't even know what to call it, this probably one person, but spewing out stuff that kind of got that allegation that there were these voter fraud problems in California in particular, and those numbers really come out of that source, which is really interesting. And I haven't seen anybody writing about that yet, but I think it's a really interesting connection that needs to be made. So when Trump started saying there were 5 million, fraudulent voters, he was getting that data from this group, and it is really a moment when I think we're challenged, those of us who are, scholars and students who are working toward being academics, or maybe even anyone who's evidence-based. It's a challenging moment, right, to counter. There are just some people who are not willing to listen, it seems. On the other hand, I will share that over the last month, because the book came out, the new edition came out a month ago, February 6th, I have done about 25 radio interviews. And some of them have been in kind of conservative stations. There was one on Biz Talk Radio, and there was one in West Virginia. It was mostly a kind of a Christian, somewhat conservative radio audience. And in those conversations, I have found that people, at least the people who call in and, the host, that I'm able to engage, right, at some level. So I think there's still hope. But I think at the level of the national media, it's really, really hard. And so I think that there's much more hope at the kind of, in the old-fashioned ways, getting off of social media and interacting with people. And, for what it's worth, that is my radio experience. Let me come back, sir, to your question or your comment about the Senate race. And I do think it's an incredibly important race. I was actually on a panel with Senator De Leon back in the fall when we launched the Luskin School's Latino Politics and Policy Institute. And he had just announced that week that he was going to challenge Senator Feinstein. And there was a lot of buzz and energy in this crowd, which was mostly a millennials crowd. Is my impression, at least. It's hard when you're this old to gauge, but that was my sense, and there was a lot of excitement. I think that it was very telling that Feinstein didn't get the state Democratic Party's support, but neither did he. So I'm not sure how far, and he's raising very little money, so I'm not really sure it's going to be more than symbolic, but it is certainly an interesting one to follow. So let me come back
Can I
to.
answer back to that?
No, because I think we just don't have time because I want to get to the other comments. So I can talk to you afterwards, though. So let me come back to the first question and just thinking about first terminology. So when I said illegal aliens, just assume there were quotes there, you know. But that's not the case with Hispanics. I mean, I use the terms Latinos and Hispanics interchangeably. Now, I don't have a particular, you know, I have spent many years in my life debating these things, and I'm now at a point where, you know what, I don't much care. You say what you want to say, and I'll say what I want to say. And you notice I don't say the Latinx, because I can't get into that yet, but maybe someday I will. And, you know, Professor Carbado is way ahead of me. It is a lot less clunky than Latinas and Latinos, but you know, I'm just not very invested in that debate. And when you get outside of academic circles, a lot of people are just saying Hispanics, you know, so I go back and forth. It was very important in the book for me to use the term Mexican, because part of what I argue is a product of the racism was an effort by Mexican Americans to emphasize their Spanish ancestry. And so I wanted to reclaim that Mexican terminology, and that I still get some pushback on occasionally, especially in New Mexico. And I'm going to be there giving a talk on Friday at the University of New Mexico, so we'll see what kind of reception there is. Your more substantive point was, if I heard it correctly, was pushing back a bit on the idea that whites are really consciously embracing this return to the past. And I guess what I would go back to, and I may not have articulated this very well, but I was really saying that there's two categories of whites. There's those who say openly that they want to go back. That's the Make America Great. And they really do, I think. They want something very different. And if you know, there are a lot of people who really just think there are too many brown people here. And we've really gotten, and too many Asian immigrants. I mean, this comment that was in the news yesterday in Orange County, where a Cal State, Long Beach, I was thinking that's what it was, counselor had said to this Asian family, go back where you came from. You know, this is, I mean, I hear this regularly about, I think this is not this is out there, and there are some very serious fears, even in California, right? Even though we've kind of gotten past that in a way, I always think of it, well, we had our SB 1070 was Prop 187, thank you, David. Prop 187, and that was our, we sort of realized that we had gone too far, and then we've improved and we've gotten better, but it's still out there. So I think that there are these two camps. There are those people who are saying, make America great, I embrace it, I don't like where we're going, and in particular the nine of the 10 states that since the new century have seen a doubling of their Latino populations are in the South. And those people, those people they really do want to go back. And then I think there's another group of Trump supporters who are like, no, I actually like pluralism, and I like diversity and multiculturalism, and but I don't agree, with these policies of the Obama era, and there I think there's some perhaps false consciousness, to use a term that only people above a certain age in the audience will know, but so I guess we could have some fruitful engagement on that. Now let me come back to the really hard questions, which are the questions that Christina and Alvina raised, which are or really meaty, at least in in terms of what this book engages, which is the question of kind of comparative racialization. So one of the reasons that I wrote this book is that I started teaching this course in our critical race studies concentration right after I got tenure, because after you get tenure, as some people in the room know, you have a lot more latitude and you can choose a lot more, and you can sort of say, oh, I'm going to teach someone what I want to teach. And, you know, so I taught this course called Comparative Racialization and the Law. And I was basically saying, what do we learn if we take the legal history of Native Americans and put it alongside the legal history of African Americans, and alongside Puerto Rican and Mexican legal history, and alongside Asian American legal history? What is it that we learn from that about how oppression is interlocking, how it's different, but then how it can be mutually reinforcing, about how white supremacy is sort of shape-shifting in different times and places. And so I think when we look at that right now, I think that there is a lot of work to be done to figure out whether or not I guess I'm of two minds. On the one hand, I think there's a lot of hope right now, and there are people talking across groups and across bases of oppression, right? For example, I think about all of the very good work against the Muslim ban, the Muslim travel ban, and a lot of people really could see and name that as wrong, and you know, people who were not Muslim, who were not going to be people who were going to be mistaken as Muslim, at least in a more generic sense of racial profiling. But then another part of me sees a lot of kind of us versus them, and sometimes I can even hear myself falling into that language, right? And so in this book, I don't know if I succeed, but I really try to walk that line between saying, this is a book about Mexican Americans and has that specificity, but it's a book that is really speaking to where other groups are located, and even thinking about where whites are located, right? Because in the 19th century, you were still seeing the phenomenon of certain white groups that we think of white now. They weren't that white then. And in fact, one way they became white was to come to the West and be distinguished from Mexicans and Indians. For example, the Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe Railroad paid its track layers, and this was kind of the worst job that you could have in the railroad. They paid Irish Irish got wages that were higher for the same job than Mexican Americans and Pueblo Indians. And, you know, so that was a way in which Irish Americans could get their whiteness, right, by coming east. And so there are these really complicated interactions. And I think in particular, getting to the issue of, you know, our own racism. And I like to say, you know, my son and I talk about this because this is the way I raised him, is I say we're all racist. You know, I'm a racist. We are all racist. You cannot grow up in the society and not be a racist. And so the question is, what do you do with that? You know, I am a racist, and you know, how do you work through that, right? And in particular, there are African Americans who are racist and who have racist ideas about African Americans. And you look at some of the survey data, and you see expressions of the stereotypes from within the group. But certainly there is plenty by Latinos against other groups. And this is despite the fact that there are Afro-Mexicanos, Afro-Latinos, certainly. And also the fact, something that I talk about in the book, is that if you look at the demographics of Mexico, yikes, I didn't realize I was going on so long. Jasleen was supposed to tell me to stop. Okay, so I'm going to finish right now. If you look at the demographics of Mexico in 1650, there were as many Africans listed in the census as Spaniards. because there was a huge importation of African slaves into Mexico. But then you look later on, well, you see everybody claiming that they're Spanish, but you don't see people claiming that they're African so much. But that is who we are as Mexican people. We are a mestizo people who are African, indigenous, and European. On that note, I will stop talking, and we can go out to the reception.
There will be a reception right outside, and books will be sold, and Professor Gomez will be available to sign. And with that, round of applause.